All right. Well, thank you very much to all the organizers for inviting me and for putting this together. I'm getting a lot of really interesting ideas in my head and a lot of connections, and especially with in the East Asia context, I think you'll see some similar things that I'll be talking about. I'm an environmental anthropologist, and my research focuses on forest governance and the way that local communities think about and organize themselves around forests. And so I don't do waste per se, although I really appreciate Robin's sort of urging to all of us to recognize the ways that we do waste, right? All of us, constantly. It's a flow that we're involved in. And so this is going to be sort of an amateur attempt to theorize a little bit of this while also introducing Japan and what I'm calling collectivities of waste in Japan. So waste, of course, in one of its common conceptions denotes that which is not productive. Waste in this conception is conceived of as either the byproduct of productive activities, and the word byproduct, right, is interesting in its own right. And so these are things that have to be dealt with in some way, or they might be thought of as unproductive actions, right, when we waste time in faculty meetings, for example. So as an anthropologist, immediately when I recognize these categorical functions of waste, the concepts and the matter's capacity to sort of bifurcate the world into productive and unproductive spheres, it leads me to start thinking about cultural explanations. In his interesting book about waste in Japan, Peter Wynne Kirby, an anthropologist, his book is called Troubled Natures. He reminds us that attitudes towards waste are not universal, right? In other words, our thoughts and feelings concerning waste differ across populations and through time. One person's waste is another's treasure, and we've heard of various ways of sort of picking through waste, and I definitely have personal experiences with that as a graduate student in Hawaii, where there was this sort of informal economy of people setting their waste out on the curb, and then me coming along and picking it up and maybe putting a couple nails in it and furnishing my home with it. And so what they saw as waste to throw out was something that I saw as being wasteful, and so I would sort of repurpose their waste. And yet, as we're seeing, waste is not only in our heads, right? It also exists materially. But I want to think about the ways that that the waste that's in our head and the waste that's out there, the wastescapes, if you will. And again, I think Robin and others have helped sort of show us the ways that we think about waste are the ways that we order our worlds, and sometimes the ways that we build our physical worlds, right, if not our symbolic worlds as well. And so I think there's at times a disconnection between the waste that humans think of and the waste objects that they put out into the world. And so I think we might borrow a concept from Timothy Morton, who is an ecological philosopher or a philosophical ecologist. You might give him either label, but in a recent book he talks about hyper-objects, which he describes, and I'm quoting here, as things that are massively distributed in time and space relative to humans. So Morton's argument essentially is that these hyper-objects are sort of too big for us as humans to develop a meta-language about. We can't sort of really get a grasp on them, and they thus inform our language and our ways of thinking, and it sort of flips the table on how we think about waste, right? Or maybe the way that waste doesn't think about us but shapes us, right? So in other words, these hyper-objects, they impinge on and they articulate with human life in ways that we may not fully appreciate. So we might say that waste as object often exerts what Jane Bennett labels thing power, and this is from her book Vibrant Matter, where she tries to theorize a space for objects having agency. And so she defines thing power as, quote, the curious ability of inanimate things to animate, to act, to produce effects dramatic and subtle. And I'll refer people to an online lecture of Jane Bennett's you can YouTube it and find it, where she uses hoarding in the TV show Hoarders to talk about the ways that objects have power over people, and uses the language of the hoarders to sort of think about agency amongst matter more broadly. And I think makes an interesting point that in the age of the Anthropocene, right, as some people are calling it, and the giant Pacific garbage patch and giant landfills in central Ohio or whatever, we're sort of all hoarders in one way or another, right? We're sort of swimming around in pools of waste, as they were, or in flows of waste, right, to borrow Robin's term again. And so I guess what I want to suggest is that waste exhibits a kind of agency, a hyper-object, thing, power, icity, if you will, that is productive in ecological, cultural, and social ways, right? How else would Taiwan have a national sport of running after garbage trucks, right? If the garbage wasn't sort of telling them to do that. So what is also intellectually productive, therefore, I think, waste, I think, is intellectually productive in developing what Neera Singh, an anthropologist, geographer, and others label an affective ecological approach in which bodies, which are variously defined, are recognized for their capacities to affect and be affected, right? So this is drawing on Spinoza's philosophical traditions to think about connections, right? And the way that bodies are formed in all sorts of different ways. And I think, again, to draw on Robin's point, that when we talk about throwing away, that's sort of that conceptual disconnect with the realities of what that is, right? Just because we have sort of conceptually disconnected an object from our body, what we perceive as our body, doesn't mean that it is entirely disconnected from all the different bodies that we, our own bodies, participate in. And indeed, in Japan and other parts of the world, we find the ways that waste often comes back and reconnects with bodies in ways that may not be good from the perspective of a human body, right? Industrial disease and other forms of illness. And so I'm sort of advocating for waste as a way to help us think more ecologically, right? Something that's often unpleasant, I think, forces us into new, interesting pathways for thinking about ontologies that might better fit some of the eco-crises of today. And so I think it's a really productive space. So using examples from Japan, I want to explore these productive capacities of waste a bit and look at the ways that waste produces different forms of collectivity in Japan. And I'll look first at trash that's very much in line with what we just heard from Taiwan and looks very similar. And then if I have time, I'll also turn to thinking about wastelands in looking at rural communities in Japan. All right. So productive waste. This is an art installation in Osaka that was built using waste that had been, or objects, I should say, that had been collected along the Yodogawa and along the bay there. So disposing of trash in Japan, just like in South Korea and Taiwan, can be exceedingly complex. Indeed, it seems to me that for many Americans, for whom terms, I think still, and Jim, you mentioned this, right, was sort of people don't want to do this. I remember myself as an undergrad in a small town in northern Utah, when recycling first came around. Not only did they not want to do it, it seemed almost unpatriotic and perhaps even sort of socialist, right? Why would I do this? Well, rather than having me talk about trash disposal and explain it exactly, since we are referencing and talking about Japan here, I thought I would have these cute animated girls explain trash disposal for you. So, see if this will work. So earlier when I played this video, subtitles had appeared, but they're not appearing now. So, well, we'll watch a bit of it. So here our cute girls are explaining that the community they live in has now built a new thermal recycling center where trash will be burned. And because of that, the methods of disposal have changed now, right? And so they invite you over to this trash pile that they're going to now divide up into the different categories of trash. Which the basic ones in Japan are burnable and non-burnable, because most trash in Japan is burned, right? So, and you'll see that a lot of trash is actually burnable. This is the burnable trash. So it'll include your food waste, and no need to divide that. We're not going to give it to pigs, we're just going to burn it. And for the most part, you can put almost anything else in there, including rubber and plastic goods, although they make a distinction with CD cases, right? That's a batsu, don't throw away CD cases. So I'll go ahead and stop that. But so then they go on to talk about how not only are they burning the trash, but then the heat from the burning of the trash is going to be captured and used for energy production itself. And the facility is solar powered and da-da-da-da-da. It's all very friendly, right? Okay, so what that requires then is that you gain a knowledge of how to throw away trash. And Jim was, I think, lucky enough to find the rare gem of a single sheet of instructions for how to throw away trash in Japan. This is a 22-plus page pamphlet on how to throw away trash. So it includes this sort of graph where you can follow lines. It's sort of choose your own adventure of trash, right? Is it this size? Yes. Okay, move to here. No, move to here, right? And you'll eventually get to the end where there's a page number waiting for you. So you could imagine maybe taking a day or two to sort through one pile of trash. Right, but they do give the condensed version. This is another one-page version. Often these are meant to be hung on a wall above your trash cans, right, to write the dates of when trash will be coming. Not quite as sporty as Taiwan, I don't think, although Kirby points out in his book in an interesting way that now non-human animals come into this picture in Tokyo in particular, but other metropolitan areas as well. Crows have sort of begun to dictate the timing of trash disposal and removal. You don't need to run after the trucks and throw it, but you do need to not put it out the night before and make sure you just put it out between maybe an hour time span or something like that, so that the crows don't have time to come and pick through it. Okay, so we have our manual. The regulations on these sorts of extensive manuals began to emerge in Japan in the late 1980s, but particularly in the 1990s, and sort of accompanied increased consumption in Japan as the economy was growing during the so-called bubble times. And so they developed around that time as municipalities around the country saw increases in the amount of trash that was going into the waste stream. What was interesting, and why I use the term collectivity, is that in response to these regulations, people across Japan sort of quite organically, is my understanding, began to form collectives for trash disposal. And this was at the sub-neighborhood level. So in Japan, prior to that time, you did have chokai, or neighborhood associations, that would share obligations for a variety of different tasks, including warning people to be careful with their kerosene stoves in the winter, to be careful of fire, and so on and so forth, snow removal, things like this. But often below that level, in sort of maybe several households together, would have a corner that would look very similar to the one that we saw in the Taiwanese context. And they would organize themselves, right, and assign people to manage the waste collection activities. And so the other thing that I see is happening here, or the way that waste has been productive, is that it has produced what I like to call trash people. And here I'm riffing on geographer Paul Robbins' term of lawn people, where in his book of the same name, Lawn People, he talks about a political ecology of lawns after having started working at OSU, actually, and he found himself becoming a lawn person, and he didn't exactly know why he was becoming a lawn person. Why was he taking care of this chunk of grass in front of his house? And so he sort of talks about the emergence of that subjectivity, but all of the sort of social structure that goes with that, and a political economy that forms around it. And I don't know if we necessarily need to go that far in Japan, but I think it is interesting to ask the question of why do people organize this way? How do you become a trash person in Japan? And a happy trash person nonetheless, and a female trash person, and I'll talk about that in a moment. The very industrious housewives in Taiwan were making me chuckle, because in Japan that's increasingly a question of who's going to do all this management. All right, so I just couldn't help myself. I couldn't prevent myself doing a presentation and not citing Foucault at some point. And so I want to borrow from Foucault his use of the image of the panopticon that he uses as a way to theorize power, and more than power expression, the taking on of power by individuals, right? And so he uses this image of a prison in which prisoners are located in cells that are ordered around a central watchtower, so that the prisoners themselves have no capacity to see whether there is actually some authority figure, a guard or whatever, in the tower or not. So in other words, they're taking discipline onto their own bodies, right, in what he calls biopower. I have a student right now who, interestingly, I thought, decided to use Foucault's image of the panopticon, but talk about a glass panopticon to try to add to that image the idea of surveillance by neighbors. And we've heard about this in the Taiwanese context as well, right? And I think that's an interesting way to modify this image a little bit, because indeed, in Japan, I would suggest that it's less concerns over central authority finding you or something like that than it is maybe not your image showing up on Facebook, but people gossiping behind your back because you did not throw your trash away properly, right? So we might think of a trash panopticon. And there are more, apart from these sort of more informal, right, surveillance technologies of neighbors who are around you, there are also official roles or obligations. These are the gomi toban that are assigned within those collectivities. So this is a rotating obligation. People will do it for maybe a week or a month at a time, and it's your duty to monitor the trash collection station for both recycling and for burnable trash. So you will help to set it up. You will monitor people as they're coming in to dump their trash, and then you will clean up after it's done. And this can become quite, so the Gomi Toban and the sort of severity of regulations of trash collection and trash disposal in Japan sort of differ by location. In different places that I've lived in Japan, I've had experiences of a friend having his trash show up to his place of employment, which was at a local school. The Gomi Toban had brought his trash to school and sort of publicly on the desk in front of all the other teachers, open it up and sort of show him this one's burnable and this is how you need to separate these things from now on. I've had trash rejected for a variety of reasons with Gomi Toban who were more sort of into their role than others. So including the tops of bottles that you would have soy sauce in, for example, where you have one type of plastic and then a hard plastic on top of that. So you need to remove this hard piece of plastic because that's going to have to go somewhere different than this one. again, right, 22 plus pages. Something's up. My time's up. Am I still good to go for? Okay. Right. So this can be quite intensive, and so what develops from this, I would say, is a sort of patterned way of doing this. People begin to take this into their own being, right, of how to throw things away. What I would call a waste kata. And in Japan, kata is a term that comes from martial arts and other art forms. So in karate, for example, the whole series of movements that you do is a kata. It's a patterned way of going through the form. And indeed, the term itself is often used in a variety of different activities in daily life, but with trash as well. When you put out the trash, you have a dashi kata, putting it out, and then you also have a wake kata, or a sorting method, and so on and so forth. So this all sort of becomes second nature in some sense, and you're supposed to, as a good citizen, and indeed I think as a good Japanese, be able to do this and do it properly. Of course, not everybody does, because it can be quite intensive. This was one that I thought was, I always had a hard time with, is that not only are you supposed to cut open your milk containers and wash them out, but you're always supposed to make sure the one tab at the bottom is in the same spot on all of them, so that when you stack them, they're nice and pretty. And don't look like mine, which would be that the little tab at the bottom was in various places, so when I took it to the supermarket to recycle it, it was sort of all over the place, and it wasn't pretty, right? I wasn't performing the kata as well as I could have. But of course, you find people breaking kata all over the place as well, not performing the kata. So illegal dumping, and this will often be larger pieces of trash, right, that are more difficult or expensive to take care of. Pornographic material is often found up in the mountains somewhere, right? Things that you may not want the Gomi Toban housewife who's taking care of the trash to see your giant stack of pornographic magazines. So on and so forth. So you do find people, right, breaking the rules. And as you can see, there's cameras, just like in Taiwan sometimes, right? So all sorts of different technologies of surveillance, discipline, as well as punishment, right? Some more formal than others. So using this idea of kata, I think it really does begin to put us into a way of thinking of waste disposal, of trash disposal as sort of a node of national imagining in some ways, right? This is how we Japanese do things, right? Or should do them if we're performing it well. And so you'll get various sort of iterations in public commentary and other places thinking about how Japanese do things differently, right? And sort of and this extends beyond this to other forms of boundary making when it comes to purity and dirt, right? And impurities, right? From taking your shoes off when you go in the house to taking a bath in the evening, right? So on and so forth. There's all these sorts of different boundaries that help to mark this identity. But when we look in the public sphere of the way people talk about it, there were some interesting examples. During the last World Cup, for example, there was news stories all over the place about the Japanese fans who would whip out trash bags after the matches in which Japan was playing and would pick up trash, right? So it sort of became linked with a Japanese national identity, which is interesting to me because whether in actuality or just in belief, trash collection in Japan is still often linked with the Burakumin class, the untouchable class of Japan that is sort of a traditional untouchable class, but is legally not supposed to exist anymore and yet still does, right? And so it's sort of odd to see people taking pride in the picking up of trash, even as those who are deemed untouchable are tasked with it back at home. We might consider this as well a YouTube video of a Korean person, presumably living in Japan, saying that the Zainichi Koreans or ethnic Koreans living in Japan throw away trash and then Japanese pick trash up. And this is referencing a Halloween party that had happened in central Tokyo. Or we might consider one of Japan's most famous animated characters, Anpanman, who is a red bean paste filled pastry-headed superhero who fights against Biking Man, literally Virus Man, who is a bad guy who wants to make the world dirty and diseased and so on and so forth, right? So I see these kata, right, of waste and trash connecting to larger imaginings of what it means to be Japanese. These collectivities of waste, I think, are linked to other large-scale collectives on a national level. And these also include post-war social formations that are premised on gender divisions of labor, and this is what I was referencing as all the trash people being women, right? An emphasis on women's work that relates to the household, so that it's not surprising to see more recently 24-hour trash collection as a huge selling point for a lot of apartment buildings in Japan, right? In a Japan in which marrying age is becoming later or marriage is not happening at all, right? There's sort of much more flexibility needed. And until they develop the app, perhaps, I don't know what people exactly are gonna do, right? In other words, if Okasan, if the wife is not staying at home with the kids all day and there to take care of trash duties, it's right, there needs to be some flexibility in what that's going to look like, and so it's intriguing to think about how those things might shift as the demographics shift as well. Okay, so I've talked about trash disposal. I could talk a little bit more about wastelands, but I don't know how I'm doing on time, Jim. Should we maybe just take some questions and I can give some? Okay. Yeah, so I'll go ahead and end there, and I can take some questions, and then if other things tie in, I can maybe address those as well. So thank you for your attention.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
You were talking about how people would sometimes dump trash illegally or kind of outside the accepted social parameters of the community. Mm-hmm. Has dumping trash ever become kind of a way to rebel or make some type of like conscious statement? Is there ever like intentionally placed trash dumps? I don't know exactly what it would look like, but is that ever done?
Yeah, I don't know of any, although it would be interesting, I think, to right, because it does sort of present itself as a site of potential protest or discontent, right? But I haven't seen it happen so much. Yeah, more so it's the trying to stay below the radar and get rid of your trash without anyone seeing, right? So often it'll be up in the mountains somewhere, right, on the end of a forest road. My personal strategy when I was living in the village doing my field work, where the Gomi Toban was very strict, and it was difficult for me to be able to get past her. So I had to go back to the city once in a while to check in with my professor and things like this. And so I would just let it build up, and then I would, as I was stopping at rest areas along the way on the way home, feeding cans into these public recycling bins and things like that. And convenience stores in Japan tend to have trash cans as well, and everything is split up. And so you would get a lot of people sneaking out at night to deposit trash in those places. I noticed the last time I was in Japan, a lot of those trash cans had moved inside of the store. So yeah, I think it could be a potential site of sort of negotiation, right? But I think it's maybe has enough ideological mass associated with it that it maybe wouldn't work to the effect that you would want it, Let's see. Sure, why don't I go over here? Thanks.
You mentioned that most trash is burned, and I was wondering. You mentioned that the heat is captured and reused, so that's obviously great. But within the gases and everything, all the emissions from burning the trash be an environmental concern of its own? I would imagine like a bigger one even?
Yeah. So this has been an ongoing issue in different times in different places in Japan. And I'm not familiar with the details of a lot of cases. Kirby in his book Troubled Natures goes into them more, but one case that he does cite is this was not a burning facility, it was a transfer station. And so the community that it was going to go into was told repeatedly, this is just a transfer station. There's no danger of materials getting out or gases or anything like that. But sure enough, local residents began to have all sorts of issues, right? Health issues because of different gases and materials that were emerging from there. And this was an underground station. So that had happened there. There's a famous case, or I think, as far as I know, it still exists. There's a golf course in Tokyo Bay that's built on reclaimed waste that was incinerated, and sort of all you'd produce out of the incinerated trash was with these little pellets, and then that acted as fill, right? Grass over the top of that, and they built a golf course there. And there's actually exhaust pipes on the golf course to allow the gases to escape. Sort of like Homer's golf course again in that episode of The Simpsons. And then you're not allowed to smoke on that golf course, which is so sad for all the Japanese businessmen who are golfing there. But so yeah, there's definitely been these sorts of cases. And then further back with industrial waste, much more so, right? Most famously Minamata Disease that was caused by mercury poisoning that had entered sort of into the trophic cycle, and people were consuming fish that had consumed smaller fish and so on and so forth. So yeah, there's been a lot of these sorts of legacies. And I think that's, again, when we're thinking about the way that the waste sort of always stays with us and comes back, I think that's another interesting node to notice is the ways that it invades people's bodies. And there's an environmental historian, Brett Walker, who writes about industrial disease in Japan. And he sort of talks about the ways that nations ask their citizens to take on pain in different ways and to legitimize it and to become sacrifice in that way. And so he looks at industrial disease within that context, right? And so I think it is always going to emerge because it's fundamentally ecological, right? It's always with us. And so tracking some of those things, I think, is really important because there always seems to be, right? It needs to go somewhere, and it's never incinerated fully or anything else fully. But yeah, thanks.
So I like this idea of the connections between humans and the waste that they create. And I see, or at least I feel here in Ohio, central Ohio, we have a major landfill just south of Columbus. And so it's a visual reminder to, the waste that we produce as a community. But with incinerators and incineration, that a lot of that visual reminder goes away. And I'm wondering, and it almost seems like it could encourage hyper-consumption, or at least just consumption without realizing or thinking about waste. And I'm wondering, it seems that there's a lot going on, a lot of discourses about waste production and trying to reduce that. But is there also like countercurrents, people pushing against that, saying, well, what does it matter? We can just burn it all.
That's an interesting question. I haven't seen that sort of specific countercurrent in terms of let's go ahead and it doesn't matter. We found a solution to doing this, so let's just go ahead. I think the counter discourses have come from those who have been affected by the byproducts of waste storage or incineration or whatever it is. But there's a whole interesting, I think it gets wrapped up in identity politics as well, because those communities suddenly, and actually I was going to talk more about wastelands, but I think most recently with Fukushima, right, in the wake of the 3/11 triple disaster, those communities have become very much marginalized, as well as foods produced in the exclusion zone around Fukushima Daiichi. But there's been other communities all throughout modern Japan's history, and they sort of become excluded in their own way or sort of associated with waste, so it's hard for them to become political actors who can counter more dominant modes of consumption. And even, I think the sort of unseenness of the waste, or Tim Ingold, an anthropologist, uses the term ontology of detachment, right? Where most of us don't have to engage with waste, right, as a ecological phenomenon that comes back into our lives. But the people who do, right, unless we get some way to sort of reconnect with them and to see what the repercussions are, it's sort of hard to even think about it, right? Or to, yeah, I mean, even me today when I was seeing the photos of the landfill, it's sort of hard to compute those numbers, right, in terms of tons of trash that's being produced and things like that. So I think that's one of the important components of waste studies, and I hope that that's an outcome of these sorts of projects is being able to force people to become attached again, as it were, or to recognize their attachment, I guess is maybe the better way to put it. Yeah.
Microphone right here. So I really have enjoyed both of the Japanese and the Taiwanese accounts of the ways that the practices are encultured and become part of identity. And the way that you frame Japaneseness made me kind of wonder for both of you, what do you do, what in this system happens with, especially given the theme of East Asian and Western perspectives on waste, what happens with the transience of tourists? How are the people who are not trained in participating in the system dealt with by the system?
Yeah. I think in terms of tourists, for the most part, it's going to be, I mean, it's fairly easy to figure it out at a convenience store. If you're staying at a hotel or something, there'll be some instructions for you on how to divide things, or the hotel is going to do it for you, right? So you sort of don't have to worry about it. And to tell you the truth, I was actually sort of, I thought there was going to be a clearer sort of discourse about that. So I was, doing Google searches of gaijin, gomi, dashi, and, how do foreigners throw away trash. And there was, not surprisingly, that sort of discourse directed at ethnic Chinese people living in Japan and ethnic Korean people living in Japan, which connects to a whole broader set of discourses connected with those people. But there wasn't a lot about, the sort of Western tourist or Westerners living in Japan, right? Quite the opposite. There's always English translations in most municipal offices that explain all these things. It may be that a lot of those residents, non-ethnically Japanese residents, are tricky like me and sneak out in the middle of the night to throw away their trash, and don't write their names on the bags. That's the other thing I failed to mention, is that if you're doing things properly, you are supposed to write your name on your trash bag. So if there had been an issue, they can bring it right back to your house and say something. Yeah, so I'm not sure, but it's interesting now that Japan is emerging as a global tourist destination, and so those issues may well indeed arise as more and more tourists visit the area. Yeah.
Please remind me, is the term Gobi Toman, is that it?
Gomi Toban.
Toban.
Mm-hmm.
Did you ever get to service the Gobi Toban?
No,
Did you ever participate in that way at all?
Yeah, no, I didn't. I didn't do my civic duty. I did when I was living in the village where I did my research. I would participate in cleaning in other ways, cleaning gutters, cutting weeds, all these sorts of things. But Gomi Toban never came up as an option. They tried to get me to volunteer with the fire brigade as well, but I declined that one also. So,
I mean, this is just a follow-up question really fast. I just find it very interesting, this idea of the glass panopticon. But in this sense, the tower is still present, but it's also glass. You're just selecting a person from the community and putting them in that tower.
Sure.
And so I just don't know if there's actual power relations, if there's different Gobi Tobans that people, how do they interact with that body? on a daily level, like
with the central figure of authority. I think that's an interesting question. I mean, I think with these, there's been a lot of talk of Confucian ideals, right? And I always am cautious in how much I apply that, right, as an explanatory device. But definitely there is a strong sense that, well, let me put it this way. So if there's sort of an ongoing critique of Westerners and maybe Americans in general, right? Because we like to, what was George Bush's, I'm the decider, right? And we want our politicians to be authentic individuals and we value when they don't change their opinions for 30 years and all these sorts of things, right? This is a true person to me, it struck me when Robin was talking about this idea of throwing away, right? Because I think it does speak to a very entrenched idea of the individual as sort of, right, a solitary encapsulated entity, right? And many in Japan, and this is most definitely shifting, but that sort of person, right, the strong individual American, is seen as childlike and unable to perform kata, right, and sort of hard-headed and, right, how can you not, or they might use the term KY, kuki yomenai, you cannot read the air, how can you be so sort of stupid when you see all this other stuff going on around you. So I think that has been, in terms of relations with the state, that has been something that that the state has used to their advantage ideologically, right? In a pre-war context, in terms of emperor ideologies, right, and sort of linking the nation together as a singular family. But even in the post-war period, and sort of putting back together a Japanese identity that's based on shared blood, right, and shared culture and shared language and sort of shared ethnicity and culture and so on and so forth. So that, in other words, if you are performing Japaneseness well, that's a person who is sort of performing state functions well, at the same time. So we might think of it as sort of a distributed power or something like that, but not to throw too many metaphors out there at once.
Let's wrap up with one last question, and then we'll transition to a break and get our energy back up for the discussion.
Good.
Okay,
Good.
So one last question, please. No, just whoever's ready.
I'm going to answer your question. So when foreigners come to Taiwan, how do they learn how to do the right thing about trash? When visitors come to Taiwan, they either stay in a hotel, or they rent a place if you are doing study abroad, or you stay at a friend's. And usually it's the host's responsibility to sort out foreigners' trash, but of course it's not stipulated by the law. But I recently read an article, and it's written by an American student who came to Taiwan to study abroad. And he said the first thing he learned from the landlord, instead of rent or utility, was how to sort out your trash. And he said one night he came home and finding the landlord was going through his trash because he didn't do that right. And if the landlord didn't do that, the punishment is on the landlord. And if you stay in a hotel, some hotels, they have to go through your trash and separate them for you in order for them to be able to dump the trash, right?
Sure. Yeah.